Hi, everyone. My name is Gen, and I'm the chair for MIT Enterprise Forum New York. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're always very happy to host Clarence at the Enterprise Forum. He's a dear friend and also a very wise person. I'll leave the rest of the intro to Shaw, our moderator. But before we get started on the event, I just wanted to tell you a bit about MIT Enterprise Forum. We're a nonprofit with a focus on supporting the tech and entrepreneurship community here in New York for the New York chapter, and also around the nation and around the world. We regularly organize workshops, expert panels, and fireside chats like this, and our annual membership pass is available for those who are interested. You can learn more about us from our website at mitefnyc.org. All right, without further ado, let me introduce our moderator, Shaw, and our guest tonight, Clarence.
Thank you so much, gang, and welcome everybody, obviously, to this event. So thanks for taking the time to talk to us. Quick intro about myself. Most recently, I led product and product design in New York City for a life insurance tech company called Haven Life. But I'm honored here today, actually, to be the moderator of this panel and talk with Clarence in this fireside chat. For folks who don't know, a quick introduction for Clarence. Professor Clarence Lee is the assistant professor of marketing at Cornell. He received his doctorate from HBS and undergraduate and graduate in ECS from MIT. He's won awards, including the Weiss Award in doctoral research and the Clayton Dissertation Award for Proposal Award for Marketing Science Institute. But I was chatting with Clarence just a little bit earlier today. I think his biggest award recently, brand new parent. So I think that's definitely gotta be a good reward there. And I'm honored here to be able to chat with Clarence and all of you today. So the way we're gonna do this, I'm gonna leave some questions for folks who are listening. Please engage. If you have any questions along the way, I will be monitoring it in the chat and asking those along the way to Clarence. So whenever you have a question, please add into that. We're going to keep this fairly bit lighthearted, but happy to dive into areas that people are interested in. But we're going to focus upon digital transformation, trends in machine learning, and organization dynamics. And with that, Clarence, maybe I can start off a little bit as folks are joining in with all of us. One of the things we were talking just a little bit earlier today was, the pandemic has really accelerated for companies a lot of digital transformation. I think I recently saw a bit of a meme that said, CEOs accelerate this much, CTO accelerate digital transformation this much, but really the pandemic has done a lot. But I'm curious if you have folks who are joining us to walk us a little bit, maybe how we got to. Digital transformation has been going on for some time. How did we get to where we are today?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the kind introduction. The honor's mine. Thank you all for hosting me again, and Shaw. It's good to see you again. I can't believe it's been close to 7 years. I think I first met you as my student at Cornell Tech. So good to see that you're doing well. So to answer your question about the history, I think given that you mentioned our folks here are business owners, I would like to first describe the history from a business lens. I think that could set us the backdrop for the rest of the conversation today, a framework that that can help us think about today, given these tech trends that we're going to talk about. How does that actually what does that mean for us as business owners and entrepreneurs? And then there's the business framework. I'm going to start off with that, and then we're going to jump into just a history on what's been happening with the environment, both the people side, the organizational side, as well as the tech side. Okay, so let's start out with the business framework, right? So as you're asking about the history of how everything's going, how do we get to this point? This actually reminds me of a book that my PhD advisor came out with last year. Professor Sunil Gupta, he teaches marketing at HBS. In his book, Driving Digital Strategy, one of the observations that he pointed out as he spent this last decade studying businesses big and small is that you can think about the type of digital transformation that all kinds of different businesses are going into three types. The first type is you have folks that are using digital/machine learning/AI to reduce costs. Yeah, they're driving down and optimize essentially what it's going to take for you to serve the customer. The challenge that he finds there is that with those firms, those type of firms, is that you can drive your costs, down, way down. But if you're not relevant to your customer, then you're out of luck. Okay, that gets to the second type of company where they're saying, hey, we don't know how we should be adapting our strategy. So why don't we test and learn? Why don't we run lots of experiments, A/B tests and things like that to figure out what are the right things that we can offer to our customers and what are the right customers to go after. So the problem with this second type is that what ends up, especially in the bigger companies, is that you have a lot of experiments, tens, hundreds, thousands of experiments for one brand. The moment you do that across multiple brands, there's a real coordination issue amongst all of them, so that it could be that these 10 different brands are doing all kinds of things. But if they are not aligned and coordinated to your central strategy, you end up with a lot of busyness, but not a lot of real results. So that's the second type. The third and final type that he saw were folks that read Clayton Christensen. Yeah, the late Clayton Christensen and the idea of disruptive theory. So they said, that's great. Why don't we send our best and brightest out of Silicon Valley, and then we learn lessons from innovation from these startups, and then use that to basically come back and guide our mothership. The challenge with that is that he says, that's kind of like sending out a tugboat to basically figure out in an agile way to steer, the cruise liner. Yeah, at the end of the day, if you don't execute in the right way, if you don't have the culture to handle that, that could, lead to no results. Okay, so 3 outcomes, but what is the business framework I want to tie back to kind of put it all together? If you think about these 3 type of organizations and take a step back, if we view that from the lens of an age-old a framework, strategy framework that we've been teaching in business schools for the last 40 years, something called the value stick, where if you think about that first that Sunil talked about, right, driving costs, this essentially is the bottom of your stick. Yeah, how much are you actually spending to serve your customers? Now, the second type, this is experimentation. You could use those experimentations to essentially figure out the right type of customer and the right type of feature to get them. That's essentially increasing your top, your willingness to pay. And so between this region of your willingness to pay and your cost, there is this region where you can set your price and therefore region. So the margin at your current snapshot in time, that leads to the third type that Sunil talked about with the Clayton Christensen, which is if you think about disruption as the dynamics of how that margin increases or decreases over time, what are the battles you want to get into? What are the battles you don't want to get into? We can think of those 3 outcomes, or those 3 strategies of digital transformation with this, what's called value-based strategy framework. Yeah. And so I want to use that value-based framework and this value stick as the underlying lens for as we talk about the various trends, for the rest of the conversation today. Because at the end of the day, I want to be able to tie back, whether it's low code, no code, whether it's human in the loop, whether it's machine learning, whether it's, let's say, I don't know, privacy, data-free transfer paradigm that we're going to talk about later. I want to anchor that back to what does this mean for your strategy as a business at the end of the day. Okay, so that's the first bucket. And the second bucket that I want to talk into now is just what's been happening in the environment. Yeah. And so I talked about, in terms of the environment, there is the people side and there is the technology side. Okay, so let's begin with the people side. I think with all business leaders, we know that it's the key is in the people. So I want to take us back to do that for. The setting is Baghdad, Iraq. And the protagonist is General Stanley McChrystal. And the setting that he was talking about there is that he was debriefing with his team, and they just went through a review of a recent sewage plant bombing, by the terrorists, by the Al-Qaeda. And the question that he posed to his audience and his team is that, why is it that we are the most well-resourced, best trained, and best equipped military in the world? Why is it that we're not quelling events like this? Why is it that we're not beating Al-Qaeda with impunity? And the punchline that that he came to was that he was realizing we were fighting a 21st century war with 20th century tactics. And that's the beginning premise of his book, Team of Teams. Right? I want to talk about that a little bit, but to give you the snapshot of the trend in that he observed is that there is these two concepts that he thinks is a solution to how to fight the 21st century war. 20th century war really means this top-down, command and control driven infrastructure and culture that they were operating on. What he argues instead, what you should be doing, as he advises CEOs now, is that you need to make your team more decentralized and agile. But those are just buzzwords. What does that mean? These two concepts called shared consciousness and empower execution, which really just boils down to you want to let the people in the organization that have the data and have the first eyes on the data and the truth to have the boldness to communicate and share that data with the rest of the organization, okay? That's the shared consciousness, right? Removing frictions to that. But also at the same time, in tandem, you want this empowered execution where they have the culture and the empoweredness to be able to execute on those decisions in real time, okay? And so his whole premise essentially is he was thinking, this is the solution to that Clayton Christensen problem, right? As you think about your margin changing over time, I think that third part of the business framework, that's going to be something that is going to be changing the quickest going forward in the future, in the next 20 years, because of the increase of data and because of COVID, things like that.
All right.
So that's the people side.
Got it. Maybe here for the audience, are you saying that actually the acceleration, right, whether that be in machine learning or in the empowerment of individuals to really decentralize the people side, to really help do that disruption of theory and that technology? Is that what you're kind of saying here?
Yeah. So he was actually agnostic in terms of how we're going to use digital to get that empower execution and shared consciousness. I think how we actually do it. I think the devil's in the details, and let's get into that in a little bit, right? But what's interesting is that at the end of the day, as you're thinking about the willingness to pay and the cost and how it changes over time, you're essentially making a prediction on what's going to happen, right? And so as you're making a prediction, this gets us to think about, over the last 10 years, what's been happening in the machine domain and how machines have gotten better to predict. And so, Shaw, I know that you probably had a chance to, look into computer science back in undergrad with your many friends that were at Berkeley that study computer science, right? And at the time, if you think about 2005, 2006, 2004, deep learning was in the doghouse. What was hot at the time from that era in the same time is this idea called ensemble methods. Now, the fundamental idea of machine learning at that time was this idea that if you compare what they call a strong learner, essentially a monolithic giant Uber algorithm that would predict yes or no, go or no go, cat or dog, the decision, versus a collection of a bunch of what they call weak learners. Smaller algorithms, simpler algorithms that would have access to the data, make decisions on the fly. But then you have a network of a bunch of these weak learners, and you aggregate the decisions together. If you look at the both outcomes, and as you predict which one is going to do better, what would you guess? Which one would do?
I thought it would be definitely like the one who was stronger, or initially would be the ones that the single choice. But that doesn't seem to be probably true, is it?
Yeah, that was the surprise to a lot of researchers at the time, because everybody before that was trying to build a super algorithm. But then what happened was, as they realized they could have a bunch of smaller algorithms that would then vote up or down, and then you network that together, this ensemble, this network decisions together, they started to see these predictions and accuracies get better and better. And that became the precursor idea to when people said, hey, if you think about neural networks, a neural network is a network of a bunch of little weak learners that are networked together in a very structured way. And they're sending decisions up and down and left and right. And if you get the architecture right, then you're going to get a breakthrough in prediction, right? So why am I saying that? If you juxtapose, in 05, I truly believe that there's certain ideas that are time varying that would happen in different domains across human society. If you see what was happening with Team of Teams in the human domain in 05 and 04, and then you look at what happened in the AI community back in 04 and 05 in the machine domain, those two data that a weak learner collection to the data with lots of data, but then if you aggregate their data to a bunch of these decisions, that can lead to better decisions. I think that is something that basically is what leads us to today. Some of the smartest people right now that are working on both in the human domain, organizational design, as well as in the technology domain, they're trying to think about how do we take that idea to the next level? How do we remove those barriers so that people can work together in such a frictionless way? Or how do we then think about letting machines and algorithms to scale in that network, right? So that's what's been happening in the last 10 years up to now in terms of both sides of the domain.
Got it. Wow. I've never thought about it actually from that perspective, or actually heard anyone kind of presented that perspective, how you leverage maybe what I call the weak side, right, and build them together to beat maintenance into kind of a centralized, stronger force that you think will be the expert. Right? Even maybe many of us who might work in organizations, we maybe tend, or at least I myself tend to go to subject matter experts and utilize them or overutilize them in some cases. I think we're a big organization.
Yeah.
But this is maybe a change or a different way of thinking about that. Can we dive into a little bit deeper and how, if folks, maybe some of the folks who are on this call, on this Zoom, who are you trying to implement these things? How do they think about them in their day to day?
Yeah, absolutely. So I noticed there's a question in there by Gordon in there. So I'll try to take this well along with this whole day to day. And so let me just take that first. If AI makes great advances, where there's the need for humans in Stanley Crystal's team of teams, when machines do the human tasks in the teams, I would say it depends on the domain, right? If today we're trying to predict cats and dogs, or being able to tell a red-tailed hawk away from, a bald eagle, I mean, that's something where machines are getting pretty good at. Yeah. But think about running your business. Can you imagine playing your business like playing Go, right? Like, how do you even begin to think about that, right? How do you think of like the chessboard or even just the games and the rules? That's so complicated. It's essentially hard to represent that in terms of something that AI can understand. Okay, and so this reminds me of back in college. I mean, the late Marvin Minsky, right? One of the things that he was trying to tackle is this idea that in order to have AI to do anything, you got to have a way to represent things so that the AI understands, which means putting things that are in terms into numbers. Now, as you know, if you actually scratch into what a lot of AI currently can do now, and machine learning can do now, that's a big bottleneck right now, right? And so I think what's a probably more productive and more immediate future is something that Shaw, I think we could probably talk about in a little bit, is this idea of human in the loop AI, where you leave the stuff that humans are not good at doing to machines, but then for the things that are hard to judge for machines, you let humans represent that, and you let humans make decisions on that, and then you figure out, you as a leader, how do you structure an organization in such a way so that you can leverage the benefits of the machine versus the benefits of the human. And at the end of the day, I don't think this would be like a self-driving business. It would be more like a, human still in the driver's seat, but you have like a souped up GPS in essence to kind of guide you. What are you going to do in the next, 30 yards, for instance?
I'm gonna interrupt you just there because I thought that was a really good point, but maybe you can just re-highlight that, right? Because if me, and I'm gonna call the me person in the audience, say, I feel like I'm a human. I've been in the loop for some time, right? We've been working with machines since probably the days of industrial revolution, right? If I just take that layman's term in this case, help maybe some folks understand, what does that mean differently? I think you hit upon that.
Yeah, I'll give you a very simple example. So the basic definition, at least from my understanding of the literature, is that human in the loop AI is a very specific form of AI where you divide up the classification task, whether this is trying to predict, this cat or a dog, or a hawk versus a blue jay, or even what's the race to charge your customers, right? You divide that prediction task into parts that are easy for the machines to do, and you just let them go at it. But then there's parts of it where it's incredibly difficult for a machine to do, right? And which at that point, you have a decision to bring in. You can bring in a human to essentially either label those things, or you can bring in a human judgment, whether from an expert or an average daily person, and you create a system, almost like a wisdom in the crowds literature. That's a separate literature from before, where it's just a bunch of folks like voting up or voting down. Think about a souped up version of that, and then you basically bake that into this machine so that the machine can learn from the human. So if you look in actually AlphaGo, and if you look at DeepMind, some of the earliest algorithms in which how they write to train those things, is that they the reinforcement learning algorithms in such a way where they use the human as an objective to copy, right? So they basically treat that in such a way where mastered players are essentially the points that they learn from, and they've actually learned a lot of their strategies. They build upon that set of masters and draw from it inspiration. Then they mix and match. That's where the new strategies come in. Yeah.
Got
And
it.
so I see that as the same way in which human AI can go. Now, to give you some specific examples that we could talk about, I know, Shaw, you were asked to get to what was mean for everybody. Right? There's one simple example in terms, let's think about A/B testing.
Mm-hmm.
Today, if you were to run A/B tests for your product organization, could be running, I don't know, dozens of A/B tests in a given week, Shaw,
Yep. Mm-hmm.
hundreds, right? Your product, right? Now, you might be overseeing a dozen of products that are running A/B tests as well. Now, my question to you, how would you prioritize? How would you line up those A/B tests?
Yeah, I'll be honest, and maybe others in the organization here on the chat can tech, we don't do it very well, right? It's hard in essence to be on top of it, to understand all the data across the board. Sure, we bubble them up today, but in many cases, we don't use all the data that we can and try to make those decisions.
Yeah, so I think that prioritization comes down to, you getting your team together, probably a lot of communication, right? There's collaboration, making sure you're seeing the right data, the same place at the same time, and then drawing your inferences.
Yes.
And then if you guys agree, great. If you disagree, there's a way to kind of solve all that out, and then be able to go and actually execute, right? So a simple example that I heard from my students that are working at, the Amazons, the Googles of the world, is that they are having reinforcement learning algorithms essentially that would guide that queue of a sequence of A/B tests. Basically, the queue actually has some sort of key objective, some KPI, some macro level, strategic level KPI that everybody has agreed on, right? And then if you think about that as an objective function, then what happens is as you submit your, A/B test requests, right, that can automatically be then sorted in the same way, not so different from, if you're just taking your phone out and you're looking through your feed, right? If you think about that sequence of feed of ads, this photo of my, Gen's baby that shows up, right? Like there is something underneath that's deciding what should be shown next. So just in the same way, that same algorithm could be retrofitted to essentially sequence what are the right A/B tests to run. And then people can go in and say, you know what, I don't like that. This thing doesn't really matter, or that, right? And so this gets to, Gordon's question as well.
Yeah, that's. I was going to kind of maybe follow up. If that's the case, and I'm here to really argue in some cases, and therefore, he's asking the question: when the machines do the human task in the teams, but then wouldn't the machine be much better than I, in essence, in determining the ranking and making the suggestions, or could they imagine a better feature set than I could? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it really depends on how you guys think about what imagine means. If imagining means like, okay, I'm going to be able to dream up like this different version of Picasso, like a photo, as you guys have seen those, AIs can dream and they can come up with a picture. Yeah, if that's imagine, then maybe. But to me, imagining is a lot more. It's a more powerful and deeper human quality. The fact we can then not only come up with strategies and ideas that is out of the norm or with the norm, we can also, realize, hey, what does that strategy, once articulated, there's the representing of the strategy, but what does it actually mean to the end consumer, right? So even if AI can imagine strategies, at the end of the day, don't forget what you guys are doing as businesses is to basically connect with humans on the other end. I think at the end of the day, like the best businesses never forget about that fact. And so I think as a consumer, as a person, I always want to connect with some other person, right? I want to know I'm being served by a person. I want to know that the other person cares. Now we're getting to fuzzy concepts where it's much difficult to represent an AI.
Got it.
So, again, it comes back to the idea of representation. How do you represent it, right? And I think because it's incredibly difficult to represent and explain what inspiration means or caring means or what resonates with a consumer. at the fundamental core level, at the human level, I think because of that, the AI imagination is going to be limited by that. Yeah.
Got it. If I maybe take you back just a little bit, in our earlier conversation, you talked about both the people side and the machine side, right? And I think it's just an observation here is obviously we work a bit differently, right? What's optimal for a machine and how machines learn, and obviously the synchronous nature, the amount of data that machine can consume. We just took the simple example as a person, I can run all these A/B tests, but at some point in time, I can't consume all that. I just can't make heads or tails, no matter how great my spreadsheet might be. Let's maybe tie a little bit more of where do you see these two sides coming out together, or are they coming together? And how do I think about that?
Yeah, let's talk about that, Crowder. So let's start from basics, right? So if you think about what would it take to have empowered execution, as you mentioned, if we ask ourselves what is limiting each person into executing or understanding or doing all this stuff, I would say, many things coming off the top of the bat, and maybe just speaking for myself here, there's ego.
Yeah.
Right. There's ego, there's memory, and there's blind spots. Yeah, ego. Where I don't know about you, man, but Shaw, I feel like when my wife tells me I'm wrong, initially it's the correct response should be, let me listen to you. But like,
I just tell her she's right. I right away. That's what I've done.
But that's why you're a better man than I am. but then I sense that ego, getting into place, right? And so I was on a chat earlier, and there was this story about how the Salesforce CEO, right? One of the things that he really tries to do is make sure that today, in order to foster test and learn culture, he wants to identify people in the organization that are willing to put that ego aside, so that if they're proven wrong, they're okay with moving forward with that, so they can execute the right thing. That's the first thing. To your point about whole memory, like I can only probably dump all this stuff in the span of 5 minutes in a spreadsheet. But what happens if that spreadsheet becomes like a million rows that goes off screen?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's another thing. We also all have our biases and blind spots that we don't see. Yeah, and so that's something that actually are obstacles from us to basically execute in a better way. Same thing on the shared consciousness side, right? You want to ask what are the obstacles that's preventing everybody from getting on the same page? Problem here, same thing, right? Fixed attention span. Thank you for like guiding this conversation. If you go free, like my job is to profess all the time. So I might talk too long and people are
no,
like,
you're good. You're great.
You lost me, right? So attention span is a real thing. There's also friction in communication, right? Like, so if you think about the machine side, if you have two learners that are looking at the same data, they might come up with the same decisions because of the same context. But you get two humans in the same place and look at the same data, they might come up with two different conclusions, right? That could either be due to misunderstanding, it could be due to their biases, it could be due to miscommunication. Okay, so how do you then level set everybody so they're on the same page? Okay, so how do you get it so that when people that are looking at the same things, they have two different opinions, how do you reconcile differences of opinion as well? Okay, so then with all those things in mind, that's the first block. The second block then is, what are technologies we can bring in to enable an organization to have this execution or shared consciousness? So I just want to name a couple, and then I'm going to stop, and then we can dive into it if you want. So if you think about how to get to that point where we have empowered execution and consciousness, you are starting to see now where there are companies that are tackling this whole cloud collaborations to decisions business. Yeah, so examples are like, if you think about how decisions are made for corporate America, it's in meetings. Usually it's in memos or PowerPoints, right?
Yep.
And so there's what happens before the meeting and there's what happens during the meeting. What happens during the meeting, there's Zoom calls like this, that's digital, and people are communicating with each other, so we're all on the same line. There's also what happens before end of the meeting, the prep, right? So making sure that everybody's on the same page, single source of truth. Right? Examples like what Google's the Google Doc have been trying to do for the last 2 decades in displacing Microsoft. That's essentially what they're doing. Single source of truth. Getting the same to the right people. There's a bunch of now startups that came out that have gone to become public. Snowflake as one example. Looking at Palantir, looking at some of these other companies where they're trying to get you from data to insights in the quickest possible. Datalog, for instance, a startup, just got bought by Nike. That's an example there. There's also examples where you're trying to make sure that once the data is getting to the right place, it's being consumed and agreed in the right way. Yeah, so having apps that helps aid decision making, that's kind of where this low-code, no-code comes in to create dashboards. So think of a couple buckets, as well as, when you're communicating, look at Slack, look at Teams, get a bunch of these ways of communicating for the workplace. I think Facebook had a hand in it, in the Facebook workplace as well. Microsoft Teams doing the thing, right? So every one of the major tech companies are going to want to conquer that space of reducing friction. So again, what happens before the meeting, what happens after the meeting, right? This easy communication, collaboration, that's just like the first block. Second block is this idea of speed to insights. That's where low-code, no-code comes in as well. Think about devs with Jupyter Notebook. How do we make a bit better version of that? Happy to jump into that as well, right? But basically, how do we get from data to insights as quickly as you can? But then the third block is this idea that, hey, what happens after you decide on the insight and when you execute? There's also low-code where if you think about Shopify, about Square, where they're allowing you, when you're serving the consumer, they're allowing people that don't know ML to spin up e-commerce, store so that you can focus on the business aspects, right? So there's that trend on that piece. And then finally, there's this idea, once the product is in consumers' hands, test and learn from what. One of the frictions there is this idea, consumer protection privacy, which is a big theme that we've seen over the year, especially right now, what's with Apple, with Facebook and all that, just going at each other, right? It comes down to how do we protect the privacy of customers, individual consumers like ourselves. And so there's this whole bucket of what I call the data-free transfer paradigm that allows you to run those policies, whether you're doing pricing, whether you're doing willingness to pay, whether it's cost optimization, so that you could do those same things to your strategy without needing more consumer data. So, and that's protecting consumers, but then the businesses to compete with the same rules. So those are the four giant chunks that underlie what many of the ecosystem, the startups that's happening right now, happen to that. But
yeah, there's definitely like 2 or 3
it.
questions that I have definitely on that part. But I'm gonna take a question a little bit from Si Qi in the audience, which kind of maybe ties into that. And he was asking, to maybe utilize some of these, right, to a source of truth. How do you think about maybe startups competing with larger companies, right? The dominants who have all this data and maybe are more easily able to use the data or digest it and make these decisions, as an example. How do you think about that?
So I'm gonna quote folks that have much more than me in evaluating startups. So let's take an idea from Paul Graham. One of the ideas he wrote from a long time ago before he started Wiseman was this idea, you're a startup, you have these companies that are out there that are big. You're essentially like, the skinny little kid on the playground. So this whole premise is like, how do you when you get picked on big bullies, what do you do? You know what his question is? What his solution is, Shaw?
No, I don't.
You stairs. That may run upstairs. So the idea is this, right? Like, so I'll get to this just a little bit, Sichi. You basically look at what are the hard problems that are in your space that you can do. Right? You charge head up into those hard problems. If those hard problems are core to your strategy and you can solve it with a small elite team of a strip, then think of these big companies, their disadvantage, right? If you, instead of a 5-person team startup where you can just all be in the same room or in the same Zoom channel, you have a 500-person team, all these other coordination issues comes in, right? Ego comes in, politics comes in, all their stuff. There is simply, it's gonna be much harder to do and run upstairs as compared to you. So use that to your advantage. So that's the pre-data age. Currently in the current data age, I think they have a data, but I think the things that we learn about big data is big data doesn't mean anything if you can't align it to what you're doing in terms of strategy. At the end of the day, start with the business questions that you're trying to do. So, and empower and focus. Yeah. So today, if you're a startup, you should be absolutely 100% focused on one thing. You are betting your hypotheses on. Basically, make sure that space, whether it's data strategy or your actual go-to strategy, it aligns. So you can outrun the bullies. The challenge with the biggest companies is that today they're doing dozens, hundreds of different things. In Microsoft, you're worried about Facebook and Google, right? They're not worried about you per se. So there's 10 different little ways that, I remember in business school, like they taught us about how to think about when you're the lean and hungry, startup, like what a way to play it so that you go under the radar of the big folks. But I think just philosophically, I would start there, and then the rest of the details, I'm happy to talk about that.
Got it. That's great. And CG, if you want to follow up on that, happy to follow up here. Maybe Jeremy, back a little bit. You started giving some examples of tools, right, that companies are obviously now using to improve both communication. It's been using it for some period of time, whether it's like Google Docs to centralize information, single source of data. If I put on maybe just looking back in history a bit, one, I could make the argument maybe that these kind of what you see is what you do, click and drag and drop tools, they're not that different than maybe for folks that may be a little bit older on the calls, the GeoCities of the world, when you can build, HTML with MIDI files. If anyone's here still on the call, that
yes, that's right.
So if I think about it from that, is there a difference between the tools that we have now, the kind of the Slacks versus forms of of the yesterdays and the AOL Onlines? How do some of the folks maybe here think about
that? So I think some of the examples that I was about that I mentioned earlier are, talk about Airtable, talk about Squarespace, companies like that, or Coda, right? A couple things, I'm just kind of out there in terms of, I think the thing is that if you actually scratch the surface of the underlying technologies that did not exist when Geos were around, things have changed quite a bit. One case in point is broadband. Yeah, I don't know, but I was hung up on GeoCities. When somebody in the household picks up the phone, my connection's gone. Yeah, remember those days? Now, on a recent HBS seminar, I heard a very interesting comment. Imagine if the 2020 COVID happened in 2010. That would have been a much bigger disruption than we are now, right? Like, being able to do Zoom things like this, we didn't have the width to be able to do something smooth like this. So the lesson I took away from there is that this smoothness in UX and smoothness in the technology, it matters a ton in user behavior. Paul, the creator of Gmail, he has this famed 100 millisecond rule, where in describing in just user interfaces, whether it's the full GeoCity site to a fully fleshed out, essentially a smart spreadsheet. That's what Airtable is, being connected to the back end. When you span the spec of that, you want to think about if the interaction is going to take more than 100 milliseconds, what happens is the feed that you get as a user on the other end is very different. So as you have the bandwidth, as it gets better going forward in the future, as well as the different stacks that are allowing to build up, smooth that user experience gets better. This had only good, huge implications for consumers. I mean, that's a given. But also have implications for workers. Think about today, if you guys are trying to put performance together for your startup and going for your board meeting, right? The data sources you have to wrangle.
Yeah.
Think about today, if you had to put your product roadmap along with your digital marketing roadmap, alignment from there. You got to pull data from your analytics, from Mixpanel, from Amplitude. I don't know, using the instrument, all those things, right? Getting all that data in one place, pretty chore. But then once you're at, not even mentioning regressions. I mean, if you just run things like that, being correlation analysis, that's already another chore. Right? Just as back then, as reading broadband, that allows you to do videos, and that's a quantum leap from just watching static pace. What's happening now, going in the future, is that you're going to see a lot of apps and a lot of working collaboration tools are going to be more and more data driven. Just as right now, you've got Google Docs, Sheets that are nipping away at Microsoft. But then you got the upstart Notion and Coda. She's trying to bring in data, collaboration all in one place, and they're trying to replace the word processor. And just in the same way that they're trying to bring data and analysis together to replace the sheet, right? I think that's only the beginning of what we're seeing right now, that data stack. Like we are probably going to see more of the smoothing of path, so we can get from data to insights over the next 10 years. And once you unlock that piece, and what Stanley McChrystal talked about in terms of teams and shared consciousness, we can then begin to think about, can we potentially, gamify or build in switches to reduce our biases? How do we build in switches organization when we communicate on these platforms? How do we reduce our, that ego, the whole initial, when I realize I'm wrong, right? Those are very behavioral psychology things that my behavioral psychologists are studying. But I could see some learnings, we're about to enter into an age where some of those are going to get baked into productivity software tools. But people aren't really talking about that yet, because we're still kind of paving the road right now.
Got it. Okay. Maybe then I think about a question here, and I'll get to your question quick, Gordon, but just want to, again, open up the panel to others. If you have questions as you're hearing our conversation here, or you joined just a little bit later here today, I'm obviously having a fireside chat with Professor Clarence Lee, and we're all talking about everything from digital transformation all to kind of AI and what that means for humans. So welcome any questions here. But one of the things you mentioned quite a few tools, right? Both companies. And so I try to think of myself most recently working in insurance or some larger Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies where maybe those are not the top of tools that folks are using. We're still oftentimes, you talk about Google taking over Microsoft, but obviously Microsoft has got Teams. So I'm curious to hear for maybe some of the folks who are on the line, if they aren't using some of these tools today, like I'm not creating a Squarespace or I'm not using Airtable, does that mean for the people side, I should think about in my organization adopting that? How should I think about that? Am I behind as part of my digital transformation? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think let's tie it back to value stack. Today, if you are in teams and you're trying to about alignment, your team is trying to do, right? I think I would begin with just asking the question of what are we trying to do? Is it that we're going to cut costs over the next couple quarters? If so, there's ways to align, 80-20 rule, find the levers in terms of what are the big cost drivers and dial down the costs. Yeah. But then if today your goal is to try to amp up that willingness to pay, the conversation might look like, hey, who are the right customers we should be going after? What are they used for? What are their willingness to pay? And then does it make sense for us to change the branding? Or does it make sense for us to position it in such a way where now the willingness to pay is much higher, right? Like a simple example with in the finance sector, right? Like think about the people of TurboTax. Yeah. Before TurboTax came out, if I were an accountant, my willingness to pay that I can command my clients really comes down to, well, how much am I saving them? Yeah, it's a lot of money that once they get the rates from their taxes, there's a giant pie that they're willing to pay all the way up that I can basically extract rent from. Okay, that's a very honest way of looking at it. But then if you think about, today, the type of clients you can go after for clients that, have hundreds of thousands of dollars into its returns versus, that might have like 10,000 of tax returns, right? And so depending on your focus and what you're trying to go after, you would answer those questions first. Once you answer those questions and say, okay, in our process to get there, how do we 10x, how do we increase the order of magnitude of trying to do what we want to do? Whether it's decreasing or basically trying to increase the willingness to pay, right? To ask yourself that question, the conversation in the room becomes, geez, okay, if we want to access or 100K access, this high touch part, me going to serve each client, the consulting part, a tax account, that's not going to be scaled. So probably 80% of it where, let's think about that engagement that I have with each client. There's probably 80% where it's really just me sitting down with, and then they're giving me all the forms and figuring out, hey, are the 10 things you actually need to get? Can I actually put that in software and potentially bake into some sort of intelligent way, right? That's age-old rule digitization, right? And once you have put that in, you can start and test and learn. That's like the simple answer to figure out what this looks like. Once you finish that phase, the next phase is say, okay, today, what are some things that, if there's a lot of data that we have customers, are there certain patterns that we don't have the scale to operate and understand? That when machines you can bring them in, you can regressions, you can run clustering algorithms, so supervised learning algorithms. We get to the reinforcement learning, where you can see what the general patterns are for not just 100 customers, but rather for maybe 100,000 customers. And then once you see that, you can then court back to your strategy to say, there's 100,000 customers. What is a feasible way for us to start all? That's essentially your 1-3 step of your digital roadmap, right? Before you even get to the tools. And so once you get to that third stage, then you can begin to think about, once we have to coordinate and serve 100,000 customers, we probably need to hire more people.
Got it.
We probably hire the right people, right, with the right training. So how do we then make sure that we have a system in place? So when we have 100 customers, when we have 100 employees serving this crowd, those frictions that we talked about earlier, Shaw, ego, the blind spots, right? All the things, just go down like a list, making sure that you can then have the shared consciousness and the hard execution that you can do, and then have a discussion about how you can bring in these tools to mitigate that, right? That's how I would actually come up.
I love that because, and I think for this audience, it's always great because oftentimes we get stuck. This is a perfect example. We get stuck and we start tools first, right? We think about the tools when really, I think you put it very well in saying that you got to think about what your strategy, what you're trying to accomplish, starting from that perspective and going down directly to tools.
Yeah. Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind.
Here, I think one of the part that you mentioned, and I'm going to try to, Gordon, lead in your question is, in some cases where maybe organizations are getting better, we do have now more centralized, obviously, of our portions of our data. So we can maybe apply some of the algorithms and obviously the machine side, in essence, to do the things that I'm not good at. Do you vision and see in the future, or maybe even now, where AI can manage or better manage some of these unforeseen events like the pandemic or other kinds of outages, like what happened maybe in Texas as an example? Are we moving towards that direction?
Yeah. So I kind of think about this. Let's strip away AI. Let's go back to statistics. If you think about our unforeseen event, it's usually events that happen rarely in a given amount of time. For instance, in the last year or last 10 years, right? But if you zoom the time long enough, in the last 100, for instance, or the last 1,000 years, if we actually had done that, you can begin to see a distribution of what happens. Once you have the distribution, then you can tell AI to figure out, hey, if I want to target this part of the distribution, can you help me calculate the probability of it? And then given the probability, what are scenarios we can come up with, for instance, right? So if you think about, to give you an example, Gordon, think about when COVID first came out, and if you watch how the statistics in the room, how did they respond? A lot of them, their responses are very measured. And a lot of the measured responses were actually based on data from previous pandemics in the previous, right? So for instance, right, we got the Ebola virus, and there's a lot of other things that happened over the last decade and a half where certain parts of the world, come in contact with it. Case in point, Asia, right? Hong Kong, friends in Taiwan, for instance. One of the reasons why they're able to plan better and be able to control their cases down without going to full lockdowns, because they had experience a decade ago with SARS, right? So essentially, if you think about algorithmically, that's like they have an additional point, a very strong data than we do. So before we talk about AI, let's talk about data points. Yeah. So if we can think about in your business, if there are other data points that you can gather, right, comps, whether it's from a nearby industry or from a different time, or maybe it's a pricing strategy that has been done in another department or another brand. If you can take part of data, not 100%, maybe like 80% or 70% of learnings, and automatically bake that into current decisions, then you're going to be a better place to handle unforeseen events going forward. So I remember looking at your grad school when we learned statistics. First year, you learn frequency statistics. Yeah. And second year, once you've gotten the mastery, the conventional statistics, p-values, confidence, and all that, you learn a different branch of statistics called Bayes statistics. And the fundamental idea behind Bayes statistics is the idea that everything that you want to measure under the sun. It could be price, it could be customer willingness to pay, it could, advertising elasticity, naming business examples here. That statistic could have prior. And the priors, they could be been with previous data. There's from previous trials, whether it's your previous lessons and things like that. Once you bake that in, this rule allows to actually update and erase those priors with data as real data comes in. Right? That essentially is a way for you to marry what you now versus what you before in a very scientific way, so that you can make decisions under low data settings where things are unforeseen. So Shaw, I don't know if we lost you.
Oh, sorry. My mic was muted, so that was my fault. You can ignore that. But I wanted to kind of just, again, I see some still folks obviously here. I'm just looking at particularly about 10 minutes or so. And so just opening up if there's any other questions.
I'm seeming to have a audio difficulty.
Can you hear me? Can others hear me? Can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. Thank you for the chat. I also appreciate it. So if again, we have about maybe 10 more minutes here or so. I welcome others, and as obviously in this chat, hearing from Clarence has definitely given me insight and things that I don't think about, obviously in many cases as practitioners. So I just want, if there's any other folks who have any questions here in our remaining about 10 minutes, so I'm more than happy to guide them. But if not, I think one of the things that I observed or just heard in this kind of conversation, if I go back and think about what you originally talked in the beginning, right? How we got here, in essence, from both, the initial focus maybe on reducing costs, and then the focus on experimentation, and then connecting all of that into kind of the people and the machine side, kind of putting them together. One of the questions that I have in here is, I think in day-to-day execution, sometimes we tend to maybe forget how these two things connect, right? So we might have a very tactical focused goal that says, hey, my objective is to reduce costs, but we lose maybe the people side of that. So I wonder if you have any tips for those of us who get down into the weeds, like, with this chat goes over, I go back to my job on the day-to-day, and now I'm focusing on reducing costs, how we can maybe maintain some of this top of mind, whether that be thinking about tools or thinking about the people side, the ego, the memory, the blind spots and biases we might have. Anything that you might suggest there?
Yeah. So I think it really boils down back to people, the people that you work with, the people that you lead, the people that you manage and report to as well. Got to start there first, right? So today, if you think about what separates the KPIs that maybe you and I are responsible for, at a leaves level, right, of the organization, to a strategic level KPI that maybe a CMO or CEO would set, it's really just connections between a macro KPI and smaller KPIs, right? So, just in the telephone game, a message from the very top, today we're trying to serve our customers so that we drive retention at the very top. That might mean different things to different people. Okay, and so then you as a leader, I think you got to spend an equal amount of time, not just to say, hey, we got to hit the numbers, but then leave room for your team to think about, hey, are we getting to the numbers the right way? What does that mean? And is it that, we can basically, is it that we can get to, at each level as we connect back to the very top, are we doing the thing that, what we all agreed on at the very top? And then as you move back to the top, like that connection between your tactical level KPI to your, let's say, operational level KPI, to the strategic level KPI, that connection itself, sometimes people kind of skip over it. I think communicating and making sure that the mapping between that, right? So if you even, I'm just kind of almost drawing out like a neural network in some ways, right? The edges that gets mapped up by itself, that itself is just as important.
Got it.
And so I think at the end of the day, I think being mindful of what that mapping is, but then being able to articulate, what does this mean for our customer? What does this mean for our employee? Like that's just as important, right? And so I'll just end on one more thought. One of the ideas that I really enjoyed from the late Clayton Christensen is this idea that, he said management, it can potentially be a very noble profession. How? He mentioned this idea that when he saw that, it was from like a company barbecue where one of his coworkers, like he was imagining the coworker, going home to her family. Yeah. At the end of a long day, if she feels not appreciated, not understood, right? Doesn't really understand how, what she's doing connects to the very top. If all that is not very clear for her, the way that she might, take it out, when she gets home, she's stressed, she's unappreciated, like the way she treats her children, the way she treats her husband, right? Like that can be very different compared to this other scenario where imagine if she were empowered, she feels that she's growing, right? She feels like what she's doing there has a purpose. And it's actually, she's learning a ton and she's being with people that she wants to become like. Yeah. All the stuff that hard to measure, hard to AI-fy, but it's very, very important for the human space, right? Like if you can get that latter picture, then imagine how much of a positive effect we have on society. Yeah. And so then the idea there then is like, I'm thinking, okay, well, at the end of this, whenever you're thinking about, driving that deadline or setting up this metric, you as a leader, my call to you guys all is an implore, think about those two pictures, right? The people that are serving you, is it the former or is it the latter? If you can try to aim for the latter, then the workplace becomes a much more life-giving place. And then that way, I bet you can probably outcompete your competitors a lot faster and a lot better.
Got it. I know there's still maybe some questions here, but I just want to take at least a minute here and share some takeaways, I think, for folks as we've kind of gone through what I actually think is a journey in our conversation, right? Starting all the way back from thinking a little bit about how we got here, from what you shared early on about the initial focus for the kind of cost reductions, experimentation, the examples of actually going out and what disruption means, and kind of the small boat guiding the large boat in this case. But I really like the part where as we come to maybe the end part of this conversation, you actually bring it back to the people, right? And to the human side, and kind of the takeaway that I've not thought about for myself, at least, is on the ego, my own capabilities, and what that means for empowering individuals in that sense. I do have a question. If individuals wanted to follow up and had some specific questions for you, even after this, how would you be comfortable if they were to reach out? How might they actually reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, folks, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I think my email, I'm just going to type it in here. It's just clarence.lee@cornell.edu. And I'm happy to stay after, for maybe like 10 minutes just to chat with anybody if they want to as well. So feel free to connect if you guys want to chat about things.
Then if you're opening, I'm going to take then the question from Atul. Hopefully I said your name correctly. I think he's really interested in, oftentimes when we talk about digital transformation, we typically think of the large guys, right? The ones that have all the data. So if I'm a small, medium-sized business, how do I think about that?
Yeah, I'll give you a specific example, right? So if you think about what's been happening the last 5 years, Atul, with direct-to-consumer brands, the reason why you got the Procter & Gamble's of the world and Unilever's are trying to basically buy the Dollar Shave Clubs is because they have data on what customers are buying or not, right? So you can get that with Shopify, right? The moment you have a digital storefront. And then you can correlate that with what you are doing in terms of product decisions and pricing decisions and all that. So you can repeat, test, and learn. The advantage that you have as a small to mid-sized business is that those things, those levers that you have, it's probably like a dozen, right? It's not like 100, which means you have less data to collect. And the outcome, that column, just think about columns in a spreadsheet, right? And so column would be, it could be sales, it could be customer lifetime value, it could be whatever. But if you start there, just start simple, right? Like your goal is to, let's say, increase customer lifetime value, or let's say increase retention. You can start there and then basically build out a solid data infrastructure. You can then move a lot faster than the big folks, given the current environment. Especially if you think about what's been happening, is that digital spends on storefronts has been increasing quite a bit because of COVID shopping. Yeah. So after the pandemic, there's probably one of three things that's going to happen for your competitors. One is that they're going to return to what they've done prior to the pandemic. So if that's so, you can probably know how to cut them. The second is they will probably kind of try to dial back their digital efforts, maybe try to return to some sort of hybrid, between pre-pandemic and what's currently going on. If that's the case, they run a risk of dilution, right? You can outcompete them in online if they are splitting 50% of their efforts in online and 50% in their offline. Yeah. So that's like the second type. The third and final type would be them. Big businesses are saying, you know what? This is our chance to jump in all digital. We're going to double down on that. Those are the ones you should be scared of. So for them, execution is a big risk. Think about them. Unlike you, they probably have hundreds of different levers that they got to coordinate together, right? So again, those things that we talked about earlier, tactical KPIs to operational KPIs to strategic KPIs, they got to figure out the mapping across all their hundreds of teams to do that. You just have probably one or two teams, right? Use that to your advantage to the maximum. So that's the example and the strategy and how I would think about that.
Awesome.
I think Gordon also has a question.
Gordon's question is going to be a bit, I had a version of this, as technology gets better and we're more relied upon them in this case, will there be a case where you think we lose our skills?
Yeah. So I want to challenge you to think both short-term and longer term, right? So this might get philosophical, so I apologize. If you think about today, the primary paradigm of our society is that we are defined by what we do, right? And a lot of what we do in the waking day is like what we do in work. Yeah. That's our, that's how we win our bread, right? To bring it home. And then that's what we define who we are. But that bag of things that you do in your work and the skills associated with it, it could be either life-giving or not. I don't know about you. There's a lot of folks out there that like they hate their job, right? Because 80% of their stuff and the skills that they're really good at, they don't really enjoy. Yeah. And then so I'm just trying to think, okay, so there's things that, AI is probably going to go and, replace what humans are going to do in terms of skills. But I think the conversation should be, can we use this as an opportunity to free up human time? So we can begin to ask ourselves, Gordon, what are the things you really actually enjoy doing, right? What is it about this portion that of your skills and your work that you like to craft for the next 20 years, that you want to be world-class at? And what are the things that you maybe don't want to spend as much time on, right? So I'll give you an example. My grad school roommate, he's a professor at NYU now, and he and I had this conversation all the time, right? And this might be a little bit, too philosophical, but the way we're thinking about it is that today, if we think about our job as professors, the bag of things that deals with research and teaching and committees and things like that, there's a bag of things where it just really sucks. I'll tell you, there's like things like grading papers. There's also things like creating slides that may resonate with my students or putting them to sleep. Yeah. So there's a lot of things in there where I wish AI could just wave away. But what are the things I love the most? I love the mentorship part, right? Like being able to see students like Shaw, just, go through the program afterwards, seeing how his career, blossom, being able to have real conversation about where things should go. What are the things in which we could create as entrepreneurs to make the society better? That's what I enjoy. Now, instead of spending just an hour or 2 hours in a day in an office hour, where I spend, 10 hours of all the other stuff, writing papers, checking typos and all that stuff, can I spend maybe 80% of the time doing that, where I am, essentially, hopefully making their lives better, right? Like that's what I enjoy. So then just in the same way, I want to encourage everyone to kind of think about, for your job, whether you're being a consultant or you're a product manager or you're an entrepreneur or you're operating SMB or you're an executive at a Fortune 500 company, what is that bag of things that you enjoy? And what are the bag of things that you don't? I bet those bags are probably, there's a good amount of stuff in it. And so I would then challenge you to think about how might you use AI and steer that conversation and steer that technology so that it can replace the stuff that sucks. And then not just for yourself, but what might be things that sucks for your team that you don't have the financial incentives to care about, but you have the human incentives to really care about. So you can use AI to kind of take away all those things, right? Like, so that's how I kind of think about it at a philosophical level. Love to engage in a longer conversation with you, Gordon, about that, but that's something that I deeply care a lot about. I think fundamentally that's the real promise of digital transformation in maybe 20 years, and maybe 30 years, right? But that's a really tough goal. I would be naive if I didn't say that's really tough. So it's like an asymptote. We'll probably never get there, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
God. Well, Clarence, I think it's been an honor, obviously, both being your student and now being able to kind of talk to you in this fireside Zoom chat. I can't wait till the day we do these in person back again. And I want to thank, obviously, the MIT Enterprise Forum of New York City and all the participants here. Thank you for taking the extra time and going above and beyond. And thanks, everybody, for participating and even asking the questions. Really enjoyed having this session. It's been an honor.
It's been fun. It's been an honor on my end, too. Thank you for having me.